Welcome back and welcome to the Lesser Randall Preaching Fellowship. For those of you who haven't been with us throughout the day, we've had a wonderful day. And I offer my thanks to all who have been contributing as leaders of workshops, as plenary speakers, as preachers, as worship leaders, but also behind the scenes. There are so many volunteers. You've seen them in their orange scarves, as well as the people downstairs in the kitchen and serving us the meals. There have been so many wonderful people helping us out, and I'd like to express our appreciation to those people. The Lesser Randall Preaching Fellowship was born many years ago of a vision of one of my predecessors, the Reverend Dr. John Gladstone, a great preacher in this pulpit for so many years, who inspired a whole generation of preachers in this country. And he had a vision to have a preaching fellowship where others could come and be encouraged and inspired. And for many years it operated as a Saturday lecture, and then the guest would stay with us and preach on Sundays. But 2 years ago we decided to do it differently, and we changed the format to Sunday evening, Monday, Tuesday, and last year was our first year. But to do that well, we knew right from the beginning that we couldn't do it alone. And so we have been very blessed by a partnership which has been formed and growing. A partnership with St. Andrew's Presbyterian, Metropolitan United, Timothy Eaton Memorial United Church, Christ Church, Deer Park, and the clergy there who have been such a great help. And this year the Reverend Beth Benson of St. Cuthbert's also came on our committee, and lay people from the various places. And we've been very blessed by Paul Scott Wilson and Betsy Anderson of Emmanuel College, and the seminaries of Toronto School of Theology, and then Huron College came in, and Colgate Rochester Crozier, and Dr. Marvin McMickle, the president, is with us and has been inspiring us in these days as well. So it's such a blessing to have all of this come together, and now for you, many of you as fellow clergy, to be a part of this and to grow alongside of us. And I was just speaking with Will. Will is the minister of St. Andrew's Presbyterian, works very closely with us on the committee. And Will said, let's encourage people to give committee members, and that would be Malcolm and Sinclair and Andrew Sterling. Those are the people you'll know, and myself and Will and Kevin Robertson and Beth Benson. Give us ideas for workshops, for speakers. Will's made that suggestion, and it's a good suggestion. So please do that, because this is just the building, this is just the foundation. We're going places with this, and we look forward already to next year. We've been blessed already, and we're, in terms of the participation of Dr. Brueggemann, we're barely halfway there. We had a wonderful interview with you and the Cardinal last night, and then this morning, after this morning's lecture, it was breathtaking, and the only advice I have to those who weren't here this morning, everyone else will understand this, fasten your seatbelts, because we're going places tonight. And but before we turn it over to Dr. Brueggemann, whose presence is such a blessing to us, we've wanted to have him at the Preaching Fellowship for a long time, and I have to say a word of thanks to Jeff Crittenden at Metropolitan United, because they had him on the weekend in London, Ontario, and Huron College gave Dr. Brueggemann an honorary doctorate on the weekend. But when we approached Walter this time, he said, do you know Jeff, I'm coming up to be with him. Why don't we just double up? And it's been a great thing. And so we're very thankful for your presence, and you've been a blessing. Now, Will and I would just like to ask you a couple of questions, if that's all right.
Yes.
I've told the clergy this. Well, I'll tell you this, Will. You're going to get a kick out of this. I looked it up on Wikipedia. It says you've written 54 books. We have 71 of them on sale.
Can't trust Wikipedia.
And Will told me he's written 90 books. So Will and I both want to know, how do you do it? What's your process? How do you find time to write? And
Well, I write everything longhand, and for many years I had a secretary. The seminary gave me a secretary, and now they don't. So now I have to type it after I write it, which is a great burden. But I try to write most days from 8 to 11 and then I can't do any more. So that's a pretty intense time for me. And then I do a little editing, and you just do that every day, and it accumulates. I was telling him that an old guy published a book, and he had published many books, and he told a friend he had published another book, and his friend said, "What did you call it this time?" So that's a little bit what I've done. Yeah.
I remember I was once at a friend's child's bar mitzvah, and they got to ask the kids as they were sort of going through their bar mitzvah, that one of the processes was they got to ask the rabbi any question that they really wanted to know, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. So I feel like I'm at my own bar mitzvah right now. Actually. I'm just interested. You've exposed yourself to a world of thought. You've seen the world through the lens of many people of different backgrounds and statuses and so on. And at dinner tonight, we were talking a little bit about some individuals who have had a well-lived life, and they have made a contribution. They've seen things. I'd be interested in your own reflections, scripturally, from a perspective of faith and perspective on life in the world. What, for you, is the essence now of a well-lived life?
For myself? Mm-hmm. Well, I think to have tried to use the gifts that God entrusted to me, and hopefully to be surrounded by people who love me when I die. And I have a good chance of that. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, whether we are there physically or not, we will be with you.
Yeah.
You will be surrounded as you always are. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone I have overheard a few people actually confess that they haven't read one of your books, and they wanted to know where to start, which book to start with.
Well, I suggested that Prophetic Imagination is my signature book. I look back at that book now, which was published in 1978, I think, and I'm surprised how much I keep reiterating what I wrote there with new titles.
Thank you for that book. It changed the way we read the text.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Thank
It's a
you.
great gift.
Thank you.
What's next? Writing,
I'm working on a book on money and possessions in the Bible, and I will have to do a foray into the New Testament to do that. That's a part of the deal, where I tend not to go very easily. So that's probably my last extensive project.
You must go there when you preach.
I do go there when I preach. Yeah.
How often do you preach?
Oh, it varies. Twice a month, maybe, like that. It's all, I don't preach anywhere regularly. It's ad hoc. Though I have thought, as I heard someone say, that the difference between a lecture and a sermon is about 30 minutes.
I guess my only final question is, if this writing and preaching and teaching career of yours doesn't work out for you, would you like to run as mayor of Toronto?
Well, from what I read in the newspapers, apparently anyone can do that job. Good, thank you. And I only am left. Well, it's been wonderful for me to be engaged with a number of you, and to be involved in this distinguished series is a great privilege for me. You probably won't care, but I changed what I'm going to do tonight from the printed title it's all of a piece. What I am going to do, I decided instead I'm going to read the paper that I read at Huron College Saturday night, because I decided it had come together better, and I hope it will be some use to you. There are a few people who were there Saturday night, and they can study the hymnal while I'm talking or something like that. The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is an indispensable text for the synagogue and for the church. It is a master-defining text for our Western culture. It is variously indispensable and defining because it mediates and attests the character of a God who is capable of mercy, justice, and faithfulness that issues in forgiveness, hospitality, and generosity, that evokes the world in its fruitfulness and which opens the way for fresh historical possibility. The Old Testament, with its collage of stories, songs, and oracles, reminds us always again that the world is more than the sum of our efforts or possessions or commodities. It conveys to us wonder and awe and mystery that elude our explanations. It is indeed a book of wonder. It is at the same time a huge vexation. Any attentive reader will know that the character of God given in the Old Testament is less than attentive, prone to violence that issues in retaliation and vengeance. The world that clusters around this problematic God is a world expressed in a rhetoric that defies our conventional ways of thinking and speaking, filled as it is with disjunction, contradiction, and hyperbole. So the match between this odd content and this odd way of expression defies both the seemingly settled orthodoxy of the church and the smooth explanatory reason of the Enlightenment. And as a result, we are on notice when we enter its pages that we have access to a very strange world of imagination. It is this combination of wonder and vexation that continues to summon us, and we discover that what is indispensable doesn't fit, and what is a master text for us throws us off balance, and what is defining defies all other definitions. So I want to talk about that wonder and vexation, and we'll do so under the rubric of certitude and fidelity, or more precisely, the practice of fidelity in a world of certitude. The gods of certitude are very old in the ancient Near East. These gods are regularly allied with dominant power, are beyond criticism, and operate with a system of rewards and punishments and rules and requirements. They know what is right, and they guarantee connections between actions and outcomes, and there is no forgiveness with the gods of certitude, and so no grace. It turns out that these gods of certitude are essential for an empire. Empires characteristically appeal to packaged certitudes that then legitimates political power. So the great myths of certitude are characteristically hosted in the great liturgies of state and party, that a necessary linkage is made between godly purpose and political power. The certitude that provides a basis for empire also provides a basis for religious orthodoxy, because orthodoxy tends to be a formulation of truth that intends to silence all alternatives. Thus is born an alliance between power and truth. And that twinned package of certitudes that takes liturgic, theological, and moral form also takes political and economic form that runs from ancient empire to modern enlightenment. The Old Testament maintains a steady critique of such gods, even though here and there those gods push into the Old Testament and pretend to be the God of Israel. For the most part, however, the gods of certitude are presented in the Old Testament as idols without any transformative power. So in Psalm 115, the idols are silver and gold commodities. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. They have noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel. They have feet, but do not walk. They can make no sound in their throat. They can't go like this. And if you got a God that can't clear God's throat, you got a very bad God. And then the next verse says, and those who make them are like them. Sobering. The long history of imperial religion makes clear that the gods of certitude do not intend transformation, but they intend to maintain stability and preserve the status quo of theological certitude, political domination, and economic privilege. And I am bound to say, having taught Old Testament for over 50 years, that historical criticism is a function of Enlightenment rationality insofar as historical criticism has served the gods of certitude, whereby we have explained away everything that is interesting in the text. That same flat explanatory reason now lies behind commodity capitalism that entertains no slippage about itself. In the face of such gods of certitude that regularly occupy seats of theological and political power, the God of the Bible is a God of fidelity who refuses certitude. It is that refusal of certitude that constitutes the most interesting and the most difficult interpretive problem of the Bible. That God of fidelity, already in the Exodus narrative, challenges the Egyptian gods of certitude and invites Israel to exit the Egyptian domain of certitude that was organized for slavery. This God who exercises abrasive freedom over against the packaged certitudes of Pharaoh wanted always to sponsor emancipation from the gods of certitude for the sake of an alternative life. So even much later, when David proposes to build a temple for Yahweh, Yahweh refuses and said, "Do you think I need a temple? I'm a God who goes to and fro in the land." And in this exchange between the contestation between the emancipatory God of fidelity and the God of certitude that David wanted to house, you can see what the discussion is about. That same dispute is evident later in 1 Kings 8, where Solomon dedicates this grandiose temple, and the choir sings with Solomon, "I have built you a house for you to dwell in forever and ever." Except that 3 verses later, the text says, "Will God indeed dwell on earth? Even the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built." Such a claim as residence that is made for Solomon's temple is false, because the God who occupies the biblical text is a God of dialogic engagement and relational freedom who will not be boxed in. The God of fidelity wills to be a covenantal partner in a bilateral relationship, which means first that God is kept regularly at risk, and B, that God is sometimes prone to infidelity, because infidelity is a plausible option in the practice of relational fidelity. The biblical testimony exhibits a God who is capable of a full range of emotional possibilities that runs all the way from self-giving loyalty and generosity to self-serving pride that issues in jealousy and outrage. Such a God, of course, is contrasted with the gods of certitude who exhibit no emotional depth or complexity and who would rather be described as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. It is this God of fidelity who is able to respond to the deepest yearning of human existence, but who responds in freedom that is sometimes self-giving and sometimes self-serving. So I propose it is a primary task of biblical interpretation to sort out the God of fidelity from the gods of certitude, because the gods of certitude always seek to impinge upon the unwelcome freedom of the God of fidelity in order to make God more palatable, more committed to a settled order, more amenable to the economic settlements that we prefer. Because the God of fidelity is regularly drawn back into the framework of certitude, I will take some time to characterize as best I can the God of fidelity without reference to the pressures of certitude. And I will do this in three waves. First, I want to talk about the character of the biblical text. The rabbis who interpreted the text were no champions of certitude. Rather, they found in the biblical text inexhaustible layers of interpretive possibility, so that if you have ever seen a page of a classic rabbinic commentary, it looks like Windows 10 with an interpretation up here and down here and another one over here. And they developed very complex modes of interpretation that in Christian practice ran all the way from the literal to the typological and the allegorical, all of which means that faithful interpretation requires the full play of imagination, because some meanings of the text are given from elsewhere beyond human imagination. So the rabbis saw first that the text is multi-layered and consists in many literary strands that we've tried to understand in critical categories as J, E, D, and P, for God's sake. Second, that the text is multi-voiced. It might all be credited to Moses, but Moses can speak in primitive narratives or sermons or songs of lament or songs of victory or priestly passion for precision or royal inventories of extravagance or sheer poetic playfulness. And what you notice in the Old Testament is that the tradition takes no pains at all to talk about how these genres are related to each other. They're just all put there together, and you need to work it out. Third, because the text has many layers and many voices, it is profoundly complex, which of course is why you can find anything you want in the Bible somewhere for any position you want to hold. It is for that reason that the biblical text cannot be summarized or reduced to a single account. These many voices all together create a conversation in which interpreters are permitted to participate, or they offer a process in which there is no sure outcome, but just continuing unfolding of more imagination. And because multi-layered and multi-voiced and complex, the text finally is deeply conflicted. So does God dwell in the Jerusalem temple or not? When did Israel learn God's name? In Genesis 1 or not until Exodus 6? Is the ground for Sabbath a remembrance of creation, or is it about the Exodus? Is God always present as promised or sometimes absent? These questions turn up in a zone of fidelity that can never be reduced to certitude. It is rather a process of continual engagement. Second, first the text, Sigmund Freud, great Jew that he was, took up rabbinic ways of reading the text and used those ways to read the human self. So he is powerfully Jewish, even though he fought against his Jewishness. And John Murray Cudahy has proposed that Freud's whole theory of repression was the repression of Jewishness in Western Europe, and that a Freudian slip is a pop out of something Jewish when you were trying to get by and pretend that you were a Gentile. So as the rabbis did textual analysis, so Freud did analysis of the human psyche, thus psychoanalysis. And Freud exegeted the Victorian self of Vienna that thought it could suppress and conceal and deny all of those unwanted problematics of the self. Freud's great insight is that such suppressions of self in an interest of an approved self cannot be sustained. So Freud understood first that the human self is multi-layered, which he called superego, ego-id. He understood that the self is multi-voiced, so we do speak in different voices depending on who's in the room, whether it happens to be your mother or your spouse. Freud understood that this multi-layered, multi-voiced self is endlessly complex, so that the human self is a rich, unsettled conversation that contradicted the settled self of Viennese society or the settled self that is now required by the corporate economy. Freud understood, fourthly, that the human self is deeply conflicted over against itself, which is a very old Jewish awareness that Paul articulates in Romans 7. For I do not understand my own actions. I do what I do not want, and I do the very thing I hate. Wretched man that I am. This multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, conflicted self lusts after certitude. But what the tradition knows is that the truth of the self is a self who is not able to come to certitude, even though we may be bewitched by the empire or by orthodoxy, because in the end, what the self wants is not certitude, but fidelity. Third, if we take the text seriously in its complexity, and if with Freud we take the self as complex, it is a ready move to the God of fidelity, the one who occupies the text and the imagination of Israel, whom we Christians dare say is embodied in Jesus of Nazareth. It is clear from the outset that the God exhibited in the Old Testament is no companion of the gods of Pharaoh or the empire of Rome. And the God given us in the Old Testament is no easy traveling companion for the great tradition of Western Orthodoxy. So first, the biblical God of fidelity is multi-layered. Thus, scholars have thought that they could trace out what is primitive about God and then God's great development until God finally becomes more like us. But of course, that supersessionism doesn't work, because all these markers of God are kept available and in play, these many layers. Second, that this biblical God is multi-voiced, capable of speaking in priestly liturgy and royal resolve and sapiential shrewdness and architectural plans and the lustful extravagance of lovers and storytellers that surprise. Taken all together, these many voicings of God cannot be reduced to a syllogism or to a memo, because God always has one more thing to say and one more surprising way to say it. And so third, the biblical God is stunningly complex and elusive, and just when we thought we had a settled formulation, we get another expose. The God who promised to travel with the slaves from Egypt will not let God's face be seen by Moses. The God who delivered the ark from the Philistines will not let the ark be touched on pain of death. the God who is abidingly present turns out to be absent. Thus, Job, on the one hand, can protest God's surveillance and said, "Quit watching me." And then he can turn around and say, "Oh, I wish I knew where I could find him." So forth, conflicted. Conflicted, for example, in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that great text in which God declares that He is steadfast, long-suffering, forgiving, merciful, and then that is followed by a big yet. Or in Hosea 11, God goes on this rant against recalcitrant Israel, and then right in the middle of the rant, God stops and says, "What am I doing? How can I give you up? How can I hand you over? How can I treat you like Sodom? How can I make you like Gomorrah?" And then God goes on to say, "My compassion is warm and tender, and I will not destroy, because I am the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath." This God in Isaiah 54 can admit to having previously abandoned Israel. "For a brief moment I abandoned you. In overflowing wrath I hid my face from you." But the counter verses that are woven in between, this same God says, "But with great compassion I will gather you. With everlasting love I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer." Or in Isaiah 42, this God breaks the silence. God says, "For a long time I have held my peace. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and I will pant." The tension given in the rhetoric is an ongoing surprise to us. It turns out that this God is like the text, and this God is like the human self. The rabbis saw that the text was multilayered, multivoiced, complex, and conflicted. Freud saw that the self is multilayered, multivoiced, complex, and conflicted, and the tradition shows us that God is multilayered, multivoiced, complex, and conflicted. And when we take the text and the self and God in this way, it is clear that we are remote from the gods of certitude, because they cannot respond to our deepest yearnings, but they collude in the cover-up of all of those unmanageable forces in our lives. Such gods of empire and orthodoxy are agents of suppression and denial, because they want to deny the many layers, they want to silence the many voices, they want to pretend there's no complexity, and they ride past the conflicts without acknowledging them. Such an offer ends with a beautiful, coherent, manageable existence. But we know better. Pastors know better. We know that life is multilayered, multivoiced, complex, conflicted, and no amount of silencing will ever nullify that reality. And as a result, this tradition of God invites a different kind of existence that is true to the reality of our lived life. It doesn't fit with empire. It doesn't fit with orthodoxy. It doesn't fit with the technological fixes of a capitalist ideology. But the alternative to such reductionism is a risky relationship of partnership. So I will line out two texts where this risky partnership is so clear. I consider Hosea 2 to be the great text for the articulation of God in the Old Testament. You may know it's a long chapter, and the first 13 chapters, it's all very patriarchal. I wanted you to know I know that. It's all very patriarchal, but it is this angry husband, Yahweh, getting a divorce from fickle Israel. And as you move through this tirade against Israel's fickleness, God finally says in verse 6, therefore, you want to look out for that, therefore, I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her way. And in the verse 9, this angry Yahweh says, therefore, I will take my grain and my wine and my oil and my wool and my flax, and I will uncover her nakedness. And when you get to verse 14, you get another therefore. But it's a rhetorical trick. And you don't know how God got from verse 13 to verse 14. You have to make a pause, because now God says, therefore I will now allure her, and I will bring her back into the wilderness, and I will speak tenderly to her, and I will turn her valley of trouble into a door of hope. And then this wonderful text goes on to talk about a remarriage in which he takes her back, which you wouldn't do in the Near East. And God takes wedding vows in verse 19. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and justice and steadfast love and mercy. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness. It's a wedding vow. It's a unilateral promise on God's part. And in this amazing wedding vow, you get the 5 big words of fidelity: justice, righteousness, steadfast love, faithfulness, mercy. These words are all rough synonyms. They attest a relationship that will be durable and generative and life-giving. They are the marks of the character of God. They are the marks of an alternative life in the world. Nothing here about God's power, all about God's staying power. So we may say that the Old Testament is fundamentally a meditation on these 5 marks of God. They are the ground of assurance, but they are also the source of endless dispute, because they will never yield certitude. And all that is required from Israel to come back to this relationship: you shall know me, you shall acknowledge, you shall embrace me, you shall come to terms with me, you shall do so because my fidelity will evoke fidelity in you. Even though you can never banish infidelity completely, righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, faithfulness constitute a committed relationship that has staying power. This performance of fidelity in freedom is not a robotic action. It cannot be predicted or controlled or managed. And it is for that reason that much of the Old Testament, particularly the Psalms and the book of Job, are preoccupied with God's fidelity, and they entertain the thought that God is not always faithful. Such contestation against Yahweh is answered in prophetic oracles that make the case that it is Israel who has been unfaithful. But the conversation goes on about this contest for fidelity. A second text with the same vocabulary is in the 3rd lament of the book of Lamentations, which, as you know, is grieving over destroyed Jerusalem. And in Lamentations 3, the poet can say, God has made my teeth grind on gravel and make me cower in ashes. My life is bereft of shalom. I have forgotten what happiness is. I say, gone is my glory and all I had hoped for. It sounds like the disciples on Saturday. We had hoped that he would redeem Israel. That's verse 20. But then when you get to verse 21, Don't you wonder how a poet ever got to the next verse? But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And what he calls to mind is that the steadfast love of God never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. In Hosea 2, we had 5 of those terms. Here we have 3 of them: steadfast love, mercy, faithfulness. In a season of acute infidelity and the sense of God abandonment, Israel can recall other times. No particular content is given in this poem to those 3 terms for God, but we know the content. It's all about the great miracles of deliverance. It's about life and birth and food and sustenance and emancipation and healing. It's about all of those inexplicable transformations that the empire does not want and that orthodoxy cannot tolerate. In such doxologies of fidelity, all of life teems with inexplicable acts of life and generosity. And eventually the poet can say in Lamentations 3:24, "The Lord is my portion, and therefore I will hope in him." Not the Bible, not the church, not the creed, not the liturgy, not morality. None of that is our hope. Therefore I will hope in God. This in unutterable fidelity has within it gestures of default, and God is experienced as neglectful or angry or absent or careless. No guarantees. The divine agent imagined here is capable of reversal. So as I said in Exodus 34, after all those good words, then God could say, "Yeah, I will by no means clear the guilty." Or in Jeremiah 30, beginning at verse 12, God says to Israel and exile, "Your hurt is incurable, your wound is grievous, you are terminally ill. There is no one to uphold your cause, there is no medicine, there is no healing, nobody cares about you." And then you get to verse 16 and you get a therefore, I will heal you. You know what the commentaries say about verse 16 and 17, don't you? It's an add-on. He didn't really mean it. Somebody thought the poem was abrasive, so they softened it. Can't entertain the thought that in mid-poem, God can reach deeper layers of fidelity. Or in Jeremiah 4, the first line of verse 27, God says, "The whole land shall be a desolation." And then the second line says, "Yet I will not make a full end." Gloss. As though God couldn't offer a second opinion. Because gods of certitude never think twice. If we take the entire text, then we see that this God is a working, lively partner in this vexed pilgrimage of our life. So at the end of David, Uriah, and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, David says to Joab, "Never mind, it's not evil in my eyes." And then the narrator said, "Well, it was evil in God's eyes." So in Exodus 34, divine fidelity upsets every promise of ready forgiveness. In Jeremiah 30, divine fidelity upsets the final verdict of death. In Jeremiah 4, divine fidelity upsets the promise of a full end. In 2 Samuel 11, divine fidelity upsets David's self-serving assurance to Joab. this God always comes and upsets every settled conclusion. Fidelity on God's part always presses deeper, more dangerously, more intensely beyond settlements that we think we have arrived at. Such deconstructive interruptions attest the freedom of God. It turns out that a God marked by righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness is a God of many possibilities that are not contained in our explanatory reason. The requirements of empire and the impulses of certitude want to squelch the freedom of fidelity, always wanting to manage the risks. So we fashion ideologies that seek to eliminate all the danger. We seek to empty the text of its risk by historical criticism, I'm embarrassed to say. We seek to redefine the self away from such risk, so we imagine a world of self-sufficiency from which we ban artists and poets and novelists. Or we flatten the God to orthodoxy, eliminating from purview all the texts that do not serve the package. That's called lectionary. The outcome of such a quest for certitude yields a combination of an empty text, a one-dimensional self, and a flattened certitude. But my intent is to insist with you that our efforts at certitude require two contradictions. First, they must contradict what the Bible witnesses to. If we pause over the Bible at all, we find something else. So I know the Bible is a human document written by human people. It is a work of human imagination. And I'm not imagining a single-minded biblicism. But insofar as it is an indispensable and master and defining text, it tells against an emptied text, a one-dimensional self, or a flattened God. It contradicts that. But second, such a hunger for certitude, as every pastor knows, contradicts lived reality. Everyone knows that our lives are not lived according to TV advocacies that constitute our current liturgies of certitude. Everyone knows that the right beer or the right car or the right drug or the right cosmetic surgery will not make you happy. Everyone knows that the huge money on exhibit in professional and U.S. college sports is not about anything real. Everyone knows that the deep hunger and the requirement for a well-lived life is dialogical engagement and fidelity, and it is for this reason that the Bible is a wonder and a vexation, because it is a wonder because it gives us this character who is ready for that engagement. It is a vexation because it exposes our false hope for certitudes and exhibits fidelity that is raw and undomesticated. The tradition of certitude only requires reiteration. You just have to say it again. For that reason, the ideological arrangements of tribe or sect or nation or party or church in mantra or slogan or creed. But the tradition of fidelity requires and offers risky interpretation because relationships keep sifting. And so every oracle and every song and every narrative keeps making new sounds when we listen. This kind of interpretation that is the charge of every pastor to do testimony for fidelity when you are hired and paid to be an agent of certitude requires immense imagination, which, dear brothers and sisters, you cannot do if you are exhausted. So Paul Ricoeur has said that Jesus' parables are a model for the kind of imagination that we need to be doing. And sometimes when he told his parables, his disciples were bamboozled and said, I wonder what he meant by that. And he said, you all talk among yourselves about that. The world of certitude does not welcome imagination and maintains vigilance against it. And every totalitarian regime wants to silence people. So we are busy with our tax parsimony in the United States, busy eliminating arts and music from public school curriculums, because who needs that anyway in a capitalist environment? But the great promissory poems in the 6th century exile, which is the seed of Judaism, are great acts of imagination. So in Isaiah, a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. It's just a poem. Or in Jeremiah, a new covenant when God will remember iniquity no more. Or in Ezekiel, a new temple when the water of life will flow from under the altar. All of these are antecedents to the great poet Martin, who said, I have a dream that made all the certitudes nervous. Imagination. Second, this tradition of fidelity requires dialogic transactions to take partners seriously who are unlike us. Dialogue means nothing less than to take the other seriously as a carrier of significance that always jeopardizes what we hold dear. And such othering has its root in Yahweh's decision to take Israel seriously. So repeatedly in Jeremiah and Ezekiel in exile, God says, I will be your God and you will be my people, and we will get through this together. In contemporary practice, it is Buber's I, thou, and more particularly Emmanuel Levinas, these two great Jewish interpreters who have understood the dialogical process of new truth. So Levinas can say it is when you look into the face of the other that you will find newness. And I can think of no better exemplar of that than this text in Mark 6, of which Elizabeth Schlister Fiorenza has made so much. Jesus is busy teaching, and he's saying, what I have on offer from our Heavenly Father is not available for Gentiles. And then that Syro-Phoenicianite woman, the narrative, she says, but she said, let me instruct you a little here, Rabbi, about crumbs for the dogs. You can hear me all right, can't you? And it was amazing that this Messiah had to be instructed by this Gentile to break out of his Jewish certitude. And it is that moment with that uncredentialed Syro-Ephraimite woman that finally led to the church's courageous action in the book of Acts to count Gentiles as valid others in the body of Christ, so that Paul could say that in Genesis, the blessing to Abraham for the sake of the nations was the gospel beforehand. So imagination, dialogic courage, and third, this tradition of fidelity requires one of sustained contestation, being willing to walk into the dispute and hold our ground against God. So, Psalm 44, that I don't think will ever turn up in church. It's got 7 verses of wonderful doxology. That's for starters. But then beginning in verse 9, yet, always watch out for yet. Yet you have rejected us and abased us, have not gone out with our enemies. You have made us turn back from our foes, and our enemies have gotten spoiled. You have made us like sheep for the slaughter. You have sold your people for a trifle. You have made us a taunt of our neighbors. You have made us a byword. And then they say, all this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to the covenant. And if you read on down the psalm, what you get are a bunch of imperatives addressed to God about get in gear and do something. Which, of course, reminds one of the parable that Jesus told about the importunate widow. That's what we call her. It means nagging. The importunate widow in Luke 18, in which he said, pray like this woman who nagged the judge till she got justice. The tradition of certitude does not allow for imagination. The tradition of certitude does not allow for courageous dialogue. The tradition of certitude does not permit any contestation. But the trajectory of certitude finally reduces everything and everyone to commodity transactions. The trajectory of fidelity knows that the true values of life are relational. It is relationality that guarantees newness and in the meantime sustains amid anxiety. The Old Testament is a wonder because it is a primary witness to fidelity. It is for the same reason a vexation, because we always hope for some closure. But the rabbis knew you never arrive at a final reading, and they knew that because they knew if you arrive at a final reading, you will soon arrive at a final solution. The adjudication of these matters is a core task of communities of faith and the pastors that lead them. It is the main work of liberal arts, it is the main work of theological education, and it is the primal pastoral work. It's so hard and it's so urgent because we have an idolatrous yearning for certitude that cannot save.